Hi there. I hope that so far you're finding the material in this first lesson worth your time, and I hope that this PowerPoint is also worth your time. A little bit of it will reinforce some of what you have already read. And I'm calling this lesson The War on Drugs. Folks, probably not a surprise, but we humans have been getting stoned for a very long time. There seems to be some kind of human tendency or desire to detach from our day-to-day experiences. Often these have been religious or spiritual, and it's been about expanding our experience and having a different perspective on our lives. Let's take a look at some of the history around getting stoned. Bottom left-hand corner, peyote, the drug being mescaline, peyote cactus has been used for maybe 10,000 years or longer. And this is still used today within some populations. The coca leaf, further above that on the left-hand side, has been around for about the same amount of time. Also for spiritual reasons and perhaps other more basic reasons of just having more energy. And if we look around these other pieces up here, we see beer up here, a poppy goddess, poppies going back a few thousand years. Bottom right, cannabis in one form or another has been around for thousands of years, being used. I'm sorry, not around. It's been around for longer than that, but it's been used for psychoactive properties for thousands of years, and so on and so on. It begs the question, what is it about detaching or having these alternative experiences? What is it about that is so appealing to us? And if it's been around this long, are we foolish to believe that we will ever not resort to the use of substances for these different kinds of experiences? If we look more currently, I'm thinking with this slide to think about how our science has changed our relationship with these psychoactive materials, which has always been plant-based, perhaps a little bit outside of just plants, maybe some insects, I think, from way back. But in any event, primarily plant-based. And now we tamper more than ever with the chemistry at a molecular level. And this has brought us a very different kind of drug and what we now call in more modern times designer drugs. So we have ecstasy and fentanyl, which is with the opioid epidemic, I think they say that it is the cause of 2/3 of the opioid-related overdose deaths, fentanyl. PCP, LSD, etc. So these are this is a new way of digesting or getting these psychoactive substances into our bodies. That has certainly been a game changer. A lot of these drugs were quite legal and marketed. We can certainly argue that some drugs are still legal and marketed. Think about nicotine-based products and alcohol-based products. But let's take a look at some of these old advertisements. They're kind of fun. Here's Coca-Cola syrup and extract. This was an, quote, intellectual beverage and a temperance drink. So that was obviously a marketing effort for those that were trying to abide by the temperance movement, but still get a funny little feeling. And this Coca-Cola early on was derived from two primary plants, both with amphetamine-like properties, the coca plant, cocaine, and the cola plant for caffeine. Awfully good for sickness, headaches, hysteria, and melancholy. Dr. Poppy's Wonder Elixir, a cannabis extract. It leaves a pleasant feeling that lasts all day. The one bottle cure. Sleepless baby, use laudanum. And this is a tincture of an alcohol solution along with morphine. Yeah, great for kids, I'm sure. A little bit of cocaine for those toothaches. So in any event, you see, I'll just show one more here. And heroin in a bottle, get it right over the counter. So these things come and go with our policies. So let's talk a little bit about the history of drug policy. And again, you've read some important material about that. The drug policies were largely created and shaped around different demographics, around immigration issues, and around money. The more local drug laws were initially aimed at Native Americans, Mexicans, former African slaves, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and the Chinese. It really is a fascinating history if you get a chance to read a little bit more about it. Perhaps I'll mention something about it in a slide coming up. The first policy in America that I could find specific to psychoactive substances was in 1657, Massachusetts passed a law banning the sale of alcohol to Native Americans. Not to anyone else, just to Native Americans. And even there were exceptions. There were some companies that got state approval to continue the sale of alcohol. And that was, again, financially motivated. And there were agreements with the Native American tribes that for every, if I remember this correctly, for every wolf that they killed and brought into town, they'd be given some supplies, which included a certain amount of alcoholic beverages, some kind of wine, if I remember correctly. 1657. Some other highlights in the 1830s. That second bullet there is about the Opium Wars, the First and Second Opium War, a really fascinating history. Let's see if I can give a quick summary. There was a lot of money in the opium trade within China primarily, and some was domestic, grown within China, but much of it came from other countries like India that was regulated, monitored, and ruled by England, primarily the East India Trade Company. Well, the Chinese government at some point said, no more opium. And boy, that infuriated a whole lot of Brits and some other people to the point where they started a war. Yes, the war was to make opium available for trade and forced the Chinese to not restrict the opium trade. The Second War was basically the same situation, but now it was far beyond just English interests. It included American interests in other countries as well. So anyway, I find that extremely interesting. I used to think that when I hear that was about, for example, America saying no more opium from China, but no, it was lots of the world forcing opium onto the Chinese. So 1887, however, if you speed up, now in the United States, there became some biases against the Chinese, and one way to attack them through legal means is by being able to lock them up for their use of opium. Now, that was smokable opium only, and that's because lots of the upper class in the United States that were not Chinese were using opium, but not the smokable opium, at least not as much. So already we're seeing how money and racism and oppression are all mixed into our drug policies around the world. 1914, the Harrison Act criminalizes the distribution of drugs, particularly opium and cocaine. So now here in the United States, for the first time, we're really setting up a formal federal way of criminalizing the use and distribution of drugs. 1924, heroin banned from medical practice, maybe not that relevant. 1919, The Volstead Act bans alcohol. That's the 18th Amendment, actually passed an amendment to prohibit the sale or consumption of alcohol. Well, that didn't go so well. Alcohol, by some accounts, the consumption rates actually went up. Certainly crime went up. And 1933, they repealed it with the 21st Amendment. 1937, there was an interesting act called the Marijuana Tax Act. The idea there was to monitor and regulate marijuana by kind of like what we're doing now in several states, by having folks taxed on their inventory. The problem was having marijuana was still illegal, so to get taxed, you had to bring your marijuana in for the feds to give you the tax stamp, but you had marijuana that was illegal, so you could face legal repercussions by bringing that untaxed marijuana in to get taxed. So in any event, no tax stamps were ever issued. 1951 Boggs Act, mandatory sentencing, and this, I think, really solidified our criminalization of drugs. And 1956, a follow-up in many ways. We kind of have a lot of politicians just talking about get tough on drugs, get tough on drugs. So 1956, the Boggs Act is ramped up, including things like a death sentence for selling heroin to minors. 1970, along comes President Nixon, and there's lots of things happen. There's pushback against the Vietnam War. There's black movement, for example, the Black Panthers. There's the hippie movement. There's just a lot of things going on that Nixon and the other folks in administration, as well as a swath of the population, was scared of, didn't like, and had a reason to suppress it. And part of the propaganda that came out of the White House was around the evils of drugs, and that really had the intent of disrupting the more liberal, quote, hippie population, and certainly the black population in America. You can just read that. Okay, so that act created schedules. This is important policy stuff, and if you're a SUAS student, you know this stuff already. But briefly, there's 5 schedules of drugs at the federal level. And why that is particularly important is that, for example, marijuana is under Schedule 1. The potential for abuse, as you see there, is high for Schedule 1 drugs. That's why they get put there. So they're saying that cannabis, like heroin, has a high potential for abuse. Cannabis, like heroin and LSD, has no recognized medical use. There's no safe level of use. As you can imagine, there's a lot of science that flies in the face of cannabis being under a Schedule 1 drug. Because it's under Schedule 1 is the primary reason that there's been little research on cannabis. So it's a catch-22. It's considered dangerous and put on Schedule 1, and then one is not able to do any research on it to prove it otherwise. Although there have been many studies since it was put on Schedule 1 that attest to it not being properly scheduled. Then you have things like Valium and Xanax, which are widely abused, and they're way down there on a Schedule 4. And some would say that the pharmaceutical industry has a lot to do with those products being much more leniently scheduled. A little more recent history here. So we talked about Nixon and the war on drugs in the 70s. Following Nixon was President Ford. Not a lot happened then. He was a little bit more relaxed around being tough on drugs, but not much in the way of policy changed. Carter actually was proposing for an elimination of penalties for minor marijuana possession, really spoke about the decriminalization of marijuana long before that was cool. And he even ran on that platform, but it lost steam and didn't really go anywhere. Then Reagan came in, and the 80s and 90s was a brutal time for our drug policy and the consequences on so many communities. Reagan had a strong anti-drug abuse act, minimum sentencing for selling crack and cocaine, and much harsher sentencing for crack than cocaine, and that was largely in effect along racial lines. Also had implemented the idea and the position of a, quote, drug czar. Clinton came in and moved that drug czar to a cabinet position, and he also was kind of a tough on drugs policy guy. Refused to end the sentencing disparity between smokable and powder cocaine. As I mentioned, that came up during the Reagan administration. Rejected the idea of needle exchange programs, certainly not a harm reduction model used under the Clinton administration. Bush pushed more money toward the war on drugs, really a paramilitary approach to our policies around drugs. Obama came in and was much more progressive, did work some policy around decriminalization, allowed needle exchange program, tried to work on reducing and did reduce some disparities that were out there. Still so many to go, of course. Not really a shift toward public health approach. Known for his Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, the CARA Act of 2016, an important policy that brought a lot of research dollars and prevention and treatment dollars our way. President Trump started very aggressively, kind of in my mind, picking up where Reagan left off, and George Bush left off, get tough on drugs policy. This build a wall, part of the propaganda around that was around prohibiting drugs from getting into our country and the consequences of the drug trade in our country. Even though it's our country that's consuming the drugs, so it's a bit ironic. His first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was very kind of a throwback, if you will. Quote, good people don't smoke marijuana. Very much a strong moral model approach. And yet, under the Trump administration, with his efforts, they did pass the Support Patients and Communities Act in 2018, which directly addressed the opioid epidemic and did flush a lot of money into the system for a lot of efforts around the opioid epidemic. I want to go back to that war on drugs because so much of where we are now has to do with the war on drugs. And again, we may go back to the Harrison Act or the Boggs Act to really understand where this one came from. But the war on drugs was a demarcation line. You can take a minute and read that quote there. But there's a very fascinating and sad history about the Nixon administration's approach to drug policy, and I alluded to it already, along the lines of using these policies to suppress and oppress populations. War on drugs. Well, let's see how that panned out. This is one of my favorite graphs. 1925 to the left, and you have a population of inmates in the United States, both state and federal, on the left there. And the war on drugs kicked in right before that huge jump in numbers. 1971, the war on drugs, and you see what happened to our prison system. Now, that was not entirely because of the war on drugs, but that was a big piece of it. It was there was more than that. There was a war on, there was a war on lots of things. It was a lot of politicians getting elected because they claimed that they were going to be tough on everybody, and that would fix all the problems. I remember this stuff, certainly even back in, let's say, not so much the Nixon days, but the Clinton days, and certainly the George Bush days. And everybody was talking about how tough they would be, and they were getting elected left and right. It reminds me of the president of, I would say his name wrong, Duterte of the Philippines, who is widely popular, and he has pretty much an open policy that shoot to kill drug addicts, and they're killing tens of thousands of people with addiction issues in that country. It's a train wreck down there, and the president is quite popular with that. Incarceration rate, the U.S. at the top, as you probably know. We lock them up more than anybody else. Hasn't helped our crime rate. All right. If you get a chance, go to this website. It's really interesting. If every state was a country, and it shows how each state locks up more folks than other countries in total. How did it happen? It's by putting people in prisons and jails. Sometimes we don't even count the numbers of folks that are in local jails. But here's 1980 versus 2017 with state prisons, federal, and jails. Harsher sentencing laws. These are life sentences. Who are the people being locked up? And as I've mentioned, it is not evenly distributed. As you can see here, Black folks are locked up by much greater rates than both Hispanic and white folks. And if you have not read the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that's worth a read. You will cringe, and it'll validate what you have already been thinking about our state of affairs. Rates of drug use and sales by race. So this is just Black folk and white folk. And on the left-hand side, the use of drugs, you see that white folks use more than Black folks. Selling drugs about the same. But now look at on the right-hand side. In terms of being arrested for drugs, Black folks are being arrested at a much higher rate. Drug-related incarceration, same thing, drug-related incarceration at both the state and federal level. This one is a little bit outdated. I couldn't find one more recent, but these are residents born in 2001. This is a few years. In any event, I found some other charts, and it's not too dissimilar. There has been some improvement, actually, but here's likelihood of imprisonment. And not only in human lives, but fiscally, you can see here how much money we're spending. Yet, the rate of addiction is virtually unchanged. So, historically, we've taken a criminal justice policy model. It really spiked in 1971 when President Nixon declared drugs as, quote, public enemy number one, and the war on drugs continues today. The rest of the slideshow are statistics, mostly about prevalence. To review those slides, please go to the PowerPoint presentation that does not include the audio, located on Lesson 1.
Go to play, go to slideshow from beginning.
From view? I've never done it this way.
Slideshow. From beginning. And then talk, you do your thing, talk.
Is it recording? Is it recording now?
Talk.
Talk.
And then when you're done with that, click on the next
one. Don't touch my mouse.
Click on the next one. And then when you're done with the whole thing, you can edit out the beginning and the end where you were going into.
Well, how do I just escape here, maybe?
Yeah, when you're done, click escape and then go down to Camtasia and click, stop recording.